The guy who follows it really closely for a living is my next guest. Christian Heiens is here. He's a political analyst and an election modeler. He's also the co-host of the Making the Argument podcast. Christian, good to have you back with us, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
I know that so far through early voting, you've been encouraged by much of the turnout among Republicans in Virginia. But Corey, my producer, tells me that over the weekend there was a bit of a setback. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, so since you and I last talked about this, Republicans have really been surging with early voting. I mean, we're at a point where up until this weekend and arguably even beyond it, Republicans were in a point where if Donald Trump won the same amount of election day votes as a percentage as Governor Glenn Youngkin did in 2021, he actually would win Virginia outright, which is kind of shocking considering that this is a state that voted for Joe Biden by 10 points. But as you brought up and hinted at, over the last 3 days, really since the weekend, Democrats have picked up a lot of ground here. I mean, they've probably picked up about 1 to 2 points or a point and a half in the total early vote. Part of this is driven by the fact that Northern Virginia has opened up a lot of new satellite polling locations in order to allow for more people to vote early, and obviously Northern Virginia leans heavily Democrat. So they've eaten into a lot of the margins that you've seen in Southside. The other thing is that on a congressional basis, the 11th district, which is mostly Fairfax County, has actually now started to outvote some Republican districts down in the Shenandoah Valley, Southwest, Southside, and Central Virginia. So Democrats have, this is definitely a case of the Empire Strikes Back, but make no mistake, though, that Republicans are definitely in a stronger position still than when you and I last talked about this.
Do you think there's any sort of explanation for why Democrats might be showing up at this moment? Is it just in Northern Virginia, just that the satellite locations have come online, so that's why we're seeing that energy, or is there something else going on?
Well, if anything, they're actually showing up late. This is a very late rally for them. They should have been doing this weeks ago. I mean, to give you an idea, Republicans are in a stronger position today when it comes to early voting than in any election that Virginia's seen since COVID. And, your listeners probably already know that, early voting really wasn't a huge factor in Virginia before 2020. So we're already in uncharted waters. It's true that they're making up ground, and I think it's in large part because of the dynamics of where they're located and what satellite locations have opened up. But at the same time, even with these gains, we're in a solid spot.
Christian, forgive me if I've asked you this before, but I'm trying to understand what you consider a Democrat vote versus what you consider a Republican vote. Is it just basically like traditionally Republican districts? You just consider those all basically Republican votes, and traditionally Democrat districts, you say those are all Democrats? Am I being overly simplistic?
No, it's definitely not built around congressional districts. There's plenty of blue voters in the 5th district, for example, right? Because you've got Charlottesville and Albemarle there. And there's plenty of Republican voters in the 7th, where I live, because it's not just Prince William. It goes all the way out to Culpeper and Orange and Green.
Right.
The way that it works is that you assign a probability score to a voter based on a variety of factors. When you and I last spoke, I talked about how, that can be demographics, that can be region, that can be partisan voting habits and primaries. And so what you do is you take that probability score and then you assign it to a voter and you say this person has a 60 or 70 or 80% chance of being a Democrat or Republican. And when you apply that out on a congressional basis or a county basis or a statewide basis, that's how you get the partisan breakdown.
Okay. So, but it is possible that that your measurement is it maybe could miss, that there may be some overzealous, say, Republican enthusiasm in Fairfax County. You're not quite sure on what the actual partisan breakdown in that county would be.
So, yes, that's definitely correct that the model's not going to be 100% accurate. But, what's really interesting is the model is almost certainly more favorable to Democrats than what the final election results will be. And the reason why is because the breakdown of swing voters, these are individuals that, it doesn't matter how you slice it and dice it, you just can't figure out if they're going to be a Democrat or Republican. Democrats always win swing voters when it comes to early voting because they win the early vote. But the model that I'm running right now is almost certainly overestimating the Democrat gains with swing voters compared to what's actually going to happen this year.
Demographic modeling must be really challenging to do, especially in this election, because it seems like that there are all sorts of new coalitions being formed. President Trump has succeeded in bringing over certainly a lot of Hispanic voters, a lot of black voters, a lot of Asian voters, Vietnamese voters. And I can't tell you how many immigrants I've met in Virginia who are all Trump supporters. Does it make it challenging to figure out what demographic data to rely on when you make a model like this?
Yeah, and that goes into what I was saying just a minute ago about how, between you and I guess your listeners, almost certainly the model that I'm running this year, which I've put a lot of work into,
Yeah.
I know for a fact that it's overstating Democrats. And so when I'm putting out these tweets on a daily basis showing that Democrats are usually leading about almost 60-40, just under it in the early vote, that is actually probably indicative of the fact that they're more likely getting like 57-58%, not 59-60%.
Okay, so as of today, I know you like to try and figure out how many points the difference will be. As of today, how do you assess election day? What are you expecting right now?
So we're currently tracking for my best estimate, at least right now, is probably 1.2 to 1.5 million early votes. We could assume that turnout is going to be in the high 60s, low 70% statewide. So that probably means that you're going to see anywhere from 4 million to 4.5 million. It's probably going to be just a little bit under 4.5 million votes that are cast in total. So that means that, in terms of percentage breakdown, you're looking at anywhere from 33 to 40% of all votes being cast early, and then the rest would be cast on election day. Now, this is going to mean that you're going to see a much smaller gap between the Democrat advantage in the early vote and the Republican advantage on election day. In 2020, Trump won election day something like 62-38. He's not going to win it by that much. But honestly, we're at a point right now where even if Trump just breaks even on election day, you're looking at a scenario where Kamala Harris is probably going to end up leading in Virginia by less than 6 points. And if she's only winning Virginia by 6 points, then that spells real trouble for her in these other swing states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, et cetera.
Okay, finally, the phrase that I hear election observers use a lot is cannibalizing. To what extent are Republicans cannibalizing their election day vote by having everybody vote early? In other words, like the numbers are going to be smaller, as you just pointed out, among Republican voters. Do you have a sense of how many Republicans are still holding on to vote only on election day?
So this is a really interesting thing that I've heard people bring up on both sides, right? Either as a warning or as some sort of cope in order to explain what's going on with early voting. And it was a few days ago, I actually dug into the data in detail, and I was like, okay, let me grant the Democrats' argument for them that Republicans are cannibalizing their election day vote. If that's true, then if we remove everybody from the voting pool that has cast a vote early so far, but who also showed up and voted on election day in 2020, which is a heavily pro-Trump crowd, right? 62-38. If you remove those individuals, then you should theoretically see an early vote breakdown that's in line with 2020, because Republicans are supposedly cannibalizing their early election day, or their election day vote into early voting. So I removed all those people. I ran all those numbers. And what I ended up finding was incredible. I found that Harris is still, even after you do that math in her favor, she's still trailing Joe Biden's actual election, early vote margins by 7.5 points. And so if anybody is cannibalizing their election day vote, it's actually Democrats that are doing it right now, not Republicans.
Wow, that's a fascinating piece of data. All right, so we'll keep tracking Virginia, but I guess the key indicators and the final question on Virginia that you're looking forward is whether or not we see more energy over these next 2 weeks in this early vote.
Oh, yeah, I think you're going to see both sides try to finish strong and put themselves in the strongest possible position on Election Day. For Democrats, they know that if they don't put this thing away in the next 10 days or so, they're in real trouble. They're almost certainly going to still win Virginia because Joe Biden won it by 10 points. But they also know that if they're only winning Virginia by 5 to 7, again, that spells disaster for them in states like Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Georgia and some of these other swing states. So
I think really love
a lot of enthusiasm.
I would love to upset them, though. Wouldn't it be the best? And also, it could help us have a really easy election night. If Virginia is on the map for Trump, I think by election night we know who's president.
Yeah, if Trump wins Virginia, it's a decisive mandate for him to govern. I mean, he's winning every other swing state, and this is. It changes the electoral dynamics in a permanent way. So, no, I would love to see it happen. But you know what? Yeah. Even if it doesn't happen, if he just comes close, that's probably going to be good enough to get him across the finish line nationwide.
Because what you're talking about is there's a sentiment that's not just being felt in Virginia, but all across the country that's going to lead to whatever outcome we experience. Tell me about Pennsylvania. What are you watching when it comes to Pennsylvania? Everybody I talk to says Pennsylvania is the key state. There's a couple of election observers who think actually Michigan may be the real key state. But what do you make of the Pennsylvania situation right now?
So, I've actually got a really good friend on the ground in Pennsylvania that's in charge of the Pennsylvania Chase. His name's Cliff Maloney, and his team's out there and making sure that ballots are getting turned in early for Republican voters because that's how we lost in 2020.
Yeah.
And he told me 6 months ago, he sat down and he was like, Christian, if we get 33% of all ballots returned as a two-party breakdown in Pennsylvania, we win this thing. And I actually just pulled the numbers for him literally like a few hours ago. And as of this morning in Pennsylvania, the partisan breakdown right now for early votes is sitting at 32.74% for Republicans. And then the remainder are going to Democrats, right? So we're on the edge of getting to the point where exactly the cutoff that he told me that we need to be in order to actually flip this state. So wow. I think the early vote numbers in Pennsylvania are really positive for us. And again, if we win Pennsylvania, we're almost certainly winning the White House.
I feel like I saw somewhere that there's also like some really set in cultural feelings about voting on Election Day among Republicans in Pennsylvania. Is that true? Are we still expecting a lion's share of Republican votes on Election Day itself?
Yes, Republicans are going to win Election Day in Pennsylvania. They traditionally always vote on Election Day. Which is why early voting is so important for us, because we know that a huge chunk of our base are going to show up on Election Day, but we really need to be getting those low propensity voters, these newly registered voters, the ones that you were just talking about a few minutes ago in Northern Virginia that are voting Republican. We're trying to get those people to vote early because there's no guarantee that they're going to show up on Election Day. So any gains we make in early voting is just going to it's going to go miles towards us getting across the finish line on Election Day.
And I do have to say, I try to be as objective as possible as I say the following thing. I do think that all of the energy that I can sense is with Trump, and on the other side, Kamala Harris's campaign, I don't even really know what her candidacy is about, and I don't think voters know. And I wonder to what extent that you won't have vote switchers, but just people who would normally vote for Democrats who say, I'm sitting out this election because why bother?
Well, I mean, Democrats already know that this is a huge problem, right? Like, there's a reason that figures like Barack Obama are going to Philadelphia, and they're giving these almost like HR-style lectures to their own base voters, being like, you need to show up. It's your responsibility to get Harris across the finish line, and I'm disappointed in you. And it's like they're browbeating their own side because they realize that there's just not a lot of energy there. I agree with you that, like, I don't even think Democrats know what Kamala Harris's campaign's about, let alone anybody else in the country. And that enthusiasm gap is where you're really going to see the difference being made in a state like Pennsylvania that quite literally could come down to just a few thousand votes.
Christian Heiens, finally, early voting is coming online in a bunch of states across the country. And I'm seeing headlines frequently over the last few days that they all consist of record turnout. Record turnout in Georgia, where, by the way, the voter integrity laws are working perfectly and people are showing up to vote in that system. A record turnout in North Carolina, record turnout in Clark County, Nevada, record turnouts in Virginia. Do you think this trend continues?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is ultimately happening is all the data that you and I have talked about twice now about Virginia, it's not being confined to Virginia. It's spilling over into Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, and they're all pointing in the same direction. John Ralston, who's a political analyst in Nevada, he's left-wing. He's definitely a Democrat hack, but he knows his numbers. Yeah. He is sounding the alarm bells right now because he's telling people there is no Democrat firewall right now. And this time 4 years ago, it was something like 30 to 40,000 votes the Democrats had banked more than Republicans. And right now there's almost nothing there for them. And so he's sounding the alarm bells. You've got the same thing in North Carolina, where Western North Carolina is turning out heavily for Republicans. And this is right after the hurricane that just plowed through there. And you've got the same thing in Georgia, where turnout is breaking record numbers right now in early voting. And it's mostly coming from these Republican counties in the northern part of the state. So again, it's not a trend that's confined to Virginia, and that's why I said the numbers in Virginia matter. Not because I think Trump is guaranteed to win the state or even likely to,
Yes.
but because if Virginia sees a huge swing, it's not going to be confined to the Commonwealth. It's going to take place in all the other swing states in the country.
And this is why Kamala Harris's campaign feels so chaotic right now, and why they're keeping Joe Biden as far away as possible. Hey, Christian Heiens, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. The Making the Argument podcast is where you can hear more from Christian. Thank you, sir.